This podcast is sponsored by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London and Middlesex, both family-owned and operated. By Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Experience the difference an independent pharmacy can make for you and your loved ones. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy offers personalized care, short wait time, very competitive pricing, easy transfer of your prescription, and much more. And by Molly Maid. During these times of COVID-19, it has never been more important to keep your family safe. With the Healthy Home Cleaning System, Molly Maid London is here to help. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be today. We welcome you to the Vickers Crossing podcast. The Vickers Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. My name is Rob Henderson, and I serve as the priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Memorial Anglican Church in London, Ontario.
And I'm Kevin George, and I serve as the priest at St. Aidan's Anglican Church in London, Ontario.
My name is Ian. I am the producer of this podcast, and I hope you're having a good day out there.
Where are you from?
The Earth.
He's from Mother Earth.
Are you from London, Ontario, too? I just want to establish that we're all
a citizen of the world.
Citizen
of the world.
A global human being.
That's right. Well, welcome, everybody. We're glad you're here. This is season 6 of the Vickers Crossing, and we're just collecting along with other great guests to chat with today. Today, we're excited to welcome Clayton Thomas-Müller to the podcast. So as a way of introduction, Clayton is a member of the Treaty 6-based Matthias Column Cree Nation, also known as Pukatawagan, located in northern Manitoba. He is a campaigner for 350.org, a global movement that's responding to the climate crisis right now. And he has campaigned on behalf of Indigenous peoples really all around the world for more than 20 years now. He's coordinated and led delegations of Indigenous peoples to lobby government in Washington and Ottawa and some European nations as well. So we're happy to have Clayton on the podcast today, and he will be joining us shortly.
Indeed. And from Treaty 6, we come to this territory here upon which we record this podcast, the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapehoik, and Attawandaron peoples. Lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. These lands continue to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of this land and vital contributors of our society, and people with whom we wish to walk hand in hand on the path towards reconciliation.
And let's take a quick moment to thank our sponsors here on the Vickers Crossing podcast. First to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And a big shout out and thank you to Dave Mullen, a great supporter, and hi to everyone at A. Miller George today.
That's fantastic because they're good people over there. And we want to give a shout out as well to Carol Basada from Hyde Park Care Pharmacy. Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved. Move your prescriptions from your big box over to your local provider today.
And last but certainly not least, we want to say a huge thank you to Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. And many thanks to Trisha Lister over there who hooked us up with that. So thank you to them.
All right, guys, we've got some upcoming shows before we're kind of in the home stretch, I think, of season 6 with a little ways to go yet. So we've got some upcoming guests on the way, and we want to plug those a little bit. So, Kevin, it's time for everyone's favorite segment on the Vickers Crossing podcast. Hey, man, who in the world did you book this week?
I'm glad you asked. Drum roll, please. Well, indeed, we do have a new guest book for June, and this is a guy who's got a book coming out in June. The book is called The Road Away from God, How Love Finds Us Even as We Walk Away. And the author and podcaster, the author of that book is podcaster Jonathan Martin. And it's a great book. He walks alongside of readers as they rediscover God, even along that frightening road that many of us experience when we feel our faith is on shaky ground. So I think we very much look forward to welcoming Jonathan Martin to the Vickers Crossing podcast.
Very good. Very good. Look forward to that and many, many more. And reminder too, to all of our listeners, if you missed a podcast or you're wondering maybe there's one that you wanted to hear again, go to our website, vickerscrossing.com, thevickerscrossing.com.
The Vickers Crossing.
And yeah, thevickerscrossing.com. You'll be able to find our podcasts there. You can listen to some that perhaps were inspirational to you. It doesn't hurt to hear them more than once.
That's right. Hey, Rob, it's not like we're any Vickers, right? We are the Vickers.
The Vickers.
Like we have the definitive article. We have the definitive article. Easy for you to say.
That's right. So we invite you to check that out and join us on our podcasting journey. Amen. And right now we are going to invite Clayton to join us on the Vickers Crossing, and we'll talk about the book, Life in the City of Dirty Water, and much, much more.
Welcome on in, Clayton Thomas-Müller.
And Clayton joins us today here on the Vickers Crossing podcast. We are so happy to have him aboard today. And Clayton, we want to welcome you and understand that you, as we record this, you might be in a little bit of a snowstorm where you live. Is that right?
Yeah, they have shut the city down. Winnipeg hasn't had a snow day where they've closed the schools since I think 1967.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah,
wow, holy smokes.
You know it's bad when they shut the schools down. And they are talking about shutting the buses even down. So they're talking about up to 80 centimeters by Friday. You know, for people in the USA, that's like 40 inches. So
40 inches.
Oh my gosh, that's
and we're recording this. What's the date again, guys? Is this the 13th of April?
It's the Wednesday, whatever that is.
13th of April, and we're talking about 40 inches of snow out in Winnipeg.
Yeah, well, definitely, guys, more hardy than we are, because we're in Southern Ontario, where if you get a little dusting, you can still see the grass sticking up. We close the schools. That's it. So
yeah, both my sons are home for the next till next week, because of course it's Easter weekend coming up here.
That's right. Yeah.
So they're not going to be back at school till Tuesday, so they're over the moon.
Wow, awesome! I even saw they pushed off the Jets game.
They even pushed down the Jets game. Yeah, they were supposed to play the Coyotes, I think they were playing against. And
can't play against people from Arizona in a snowstorm.
In a snowstorm, they don't know what to do. Yeah. Well, hey, Clayton, we're so glad you're here with us. Your book, Life in the City of Dirty Water, a Memoir of Healing, is absolutely remarkable, and we're so thrilled for you and the success that it's had. I know it was selected as one of the finalists for Canada Reads 2022. Maybe you could just start by telling us a bit, what was that like when you got the phone call to tell you that you were a finalist in that? That was pretty exciting, I'll bet.
Well, it was completely shocking, to be honest. I was just having a typical work day at home. I work at a home, and my publicist from Penguin contacted me and said, "Oh yeah, I've got this fluff piece from CBC. They want to do a fluff piece on your memoir, and they want to get it out before Christmas. So can you jump on a call with them, do the interview?" And I was like, "Oh yeah, that sounds great."
Yeah.
And so I jumped on the call, and there was like 8 people on the Zoom call, and I was like, "Whoa, this is like a pretty hardcore interview. What's going on?" And my publicist, as well as my editor from Penguin, were on the call, and I was like, "What are you guys on this interview for?" And then CBC rep let me know that Life in the City of Dirty Water had been named as a finalist in Canada Reads, and it was like a very secretive process.
Oh, yeah, wow.
Yeah.
They announce a long list that I think has 14 authors on it, then it gets pared down to 5 finalists, and then they announce the winner after the debates, and but it's like this months-long process. It's very secretive, and they want to make it as exciting as possible, right? So you gotta so I walked around for like months knowing that the book was part of the competition, and going way back when I started writing this story, about the life I've lived here on Mother Earth thus far. One of my prayers I prayed for, I actually prayed that ancestors would allow this book and the stories that it holds to be a part of the Canada Reads competition.
Wow.
And so 7 years later, prayers answered.
Wow,
And
good for you.
yeah, I had the
That's
honor
great.
of being alongside some incredible authors, including
Yes.
the winner, Michelle Good,
Yes.
who wrote the book Five Little Indians, which has a
Right.
lot of similar stories. It's a story about five fictional Indian residential school survivors. And it was a crazy experience. That's all I'll say. And I definitely burst into tears and started crying when they told me. I was all cheesed out. I'm like, man, I'm sorry. I don't mean to get all upset.
Yeah.
Luckily, the folks from CBC were a little masochists. They all had big grins on their face. And they said, this is our favorite part of telling authors that they're in Canada Reads.
Yeah, making everybody cry. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like something too that, I mean, also, like, I mean, I think it's interesting in this country, right on here we are on Turtle Island. I mean, I think Canada Reads has become such a big deal. Like, it's, what is it? It's 22 seasons or something
22,
like that, right? Yeah. And so I think to be in that list, man, that's rarefied air. And I just and that you actually had that thought as you embarked on this, like, wow.
Yeah,
that's pretty cool.
No, I was very, very, very humbled to be a part of it. And, my champion, Dr. Suzanne Simard, I've known about her work for decades. And, she's a very noted ecologist, that affirmed, her research affirmed what Indigenous peoples have known for time immemorial.
Right.
Yeah. And that is that, other beings we share the circle of life with, and her research trees, are living beings that communicate with their youth. There are grandmother trees that literally feed and, provide shelter and communicate with seedlings coming up, underneath them in the ecosystem, really, really, really amazing stuff. And she did a spectacular job. I was sad that she didn't get to defend the book,
right?
More. Yeah, because it was the first book that was eliminated from the competition. But Dr. Simard did a really heartfelt and powerful. She represented the book really well, and I was very, very pleased that she picked it to be her, the book that she was defending.
So you don't get to pick your champion, do you? They just pick the book, or?
Oh yeah, that's, I think, what added to just being so completely blindsided was I didn't know what the process was. It was just. Yeah, like, I guess Canada Reads picks these champions.
Okay.
And then the champions bring forward their own book. And I think that's why you've got, I know Five Little Indians came out in 2017. And I think some of the other ones came out a little earlier and had already won other accolades. So I don't think it's dependent on being the new book on the block. I think it's dependent on whoever the champion picks, and that's what they defend.
That's awesome. Listen, before we get into a deeper conversation about the book, I mean, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about what's happened in the last few weeks here, particularly as it relates to church. I mean, Rob and I are priests in the Anglican Church, and we have a long history now of working towards reconciliation in this church, going back to the 90s when our then Archbishop Michael Piers issued an apology, and then since with Fred Hiltz. But there's obviously, a lot of what's unfolded over the last number of months. I mean, COVID delayed everything as well, but for a trip to Rome for people from First Nations, Indigenous, and Inuit who went over there, the Pope issued an apology of sorts. For those who have not heard it, I'll quote what the Pope said. He said that he feels sorrow and shame for the role that a number of Catholic Church, particularly those with educational responsibilities, have had in these things that wounded you, in the abuses you suffered, and the lack of respect shown for your identity, your culture, and even your spiritual values. All these things are contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ. For the deplorable conduct of these members of the Catholic Church, I ask for God's forgiveness, and I want to say to you with all my heart, I am very sorry. And I join my brothers, the Canadian bishops, in asking for your pardon. One of the heart-wrenching parts of your book is reading about what your mom, Gail, experienced as a survivor of residential schooling. She was taken by the RCMP from her home in Pukatawagan when she was 6 and taken to Guy Hill Indian Residential School, where she experienced violence and abuse. You write in the book that violence was something she knew well, having learned it in residential school and having learned it at home. And when you were young, you said you felt that in ways she taught it to you. So,
Mm.
you know, reading this book, it's clear that residential schooling has had that thing that we all talk about, that generational trauma and that generational impact. So
Yeah.
I just wonder if we can get your feelings at the outset before we talk about the book, about how you felt about the delegation's trip, and about the Pope's response, and where we go now.
You want the politician's answer? Or
No, I want your honest answer. Honest to God. I mean, I mean, you don't know us, but for Rob and I mean, we feel a great deal of responsibility to tell truths. And, you know, as white folks who are descendants of settlers, we carry a legacy that we need to own. And I mean, I think that whether we're Anglican or Roman Catholic or United Church or whatever else, if we work for these institutions like a couple of us do here, then it's important for us to hear what our Indigenous siblings are going through. And if we don't have truth, there will not be reconciliation. That's one thing for sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we've all heard the, you know, it's been said a million ways, but the whole no justice on stolen land,
Right.
You know, statement or meme. And, you know, personally, I think Indigenous peoples and Canadians in general are, you know, have been going through some pretty, you know, collective mass trauma events this last year, especially the last couple of years with the pandemic closure and, you know, the invasion of the Ukraine. And, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on across Mother Earth. And, you know, I think that when we look at that through the experience of Indigenous peoples, you know, all of this stuff that everybody's going through is what Native people are going through on top of, you know, dealing with you know, legacy issues of colonialism and genocidal policies like Indian residential school. And I think for most folks, you know, they think, oh, residential school's over. The last school closed in 1996. You know, let's get to healing and move on. But you know, the reality of it is that systemic racism continues to be just so pervasive in this country. And part of that is a neo-colonial form of residential school, which of course is child and family services.
Right.
There are more kids, Native kids, living in care of non-Native social workers, non-Native families than there ever was in 150 years of residential school right now.
Yeah.
And you know, every day those numbers grow. And so the trauma, you know, of our children being taken away and the trauma that individuals go through growing up in an environment that isn't in alignment with the world or cosmo view is a form of genocide. I mean, you know, it's right there in the Geneva Code on Genocide, you know, that removing children from their homes, from their culture, their way of life is an act of genocide. And so, you know, a lot of people don't understand why Native people continue to be in this perpetual state of trauma and crisis. And, you know, I think that when we look at what just happened, you know, in this delegation of incredible Native leaders, you know, I was really moved by Grand Chief Mandy Gull, I believe her name is, you know, of the James Bay Cree, who was there, you know, and she gifted the Pope a pair of Cree snowshoes, handmade snowshoes. And, you know, and of course, former Grand Chief Phil Fontaine was there, Elder Fred Kelly from Onigaming First Nation, you know, many of our great leaders were there. And, you know, to seek audience with the Pope. And I mean, I have my opinions about the approach that David Chartrand and you know, and some of the Métis representation, you know, the discourse that was put out, I thought was very divisive and unfortunate. You know, so big shout out and a little bit of finger waving and judgment on some of those political voices that, I don't know, it was just hella divisive. But you know, as far as what it meant to my grandma, you know, who's a devout Roman Catholic, went to residential school, who goes to church, you know, still when she can every Sunday, health allowing, it was a big deal, you know. And that's kind of how I try to measure things. I mean, you know, we've got our radical left in the Indigenous world, you know, hardcore, you know, anti-establishment, you know, hardcore sovereigntist, anti-settler colonial state, anti-institutionalized religion kind of people.
Yes.
That are very critical, and rightfully so, and triggered and angry by this visit and by the Pope's sort of apology. And I think that the delay tactics of the colonizer are not surprising. Admission of guilt, is a part of apologizing. And I think that the legalities around accountability are something that the guilty are consistently stressing and thinking about. And the Vatican, the Holy See, is one of those groups.
Yes.
Being one of the biggest landholders on the planet, one of the wealthiest institutions on the planet, just by saying sorry to First Nations here in Canada about the role in residential school equates to financial responsibility, reparations.
Yeah.
One of the big challenges that I put out there was that, the Catholic Church is in a position to return any of their land holdings to the First Nations, that those land holdings exist within their traditional territory. Like, part of the big problem in Canada with this crisis, this perpetual crisis and perpetual collective experience of mass trauma events that Indigenous peoples face, a big help would be, to have some control over their land. First Nations control less than 1% of Canada's total land mass, and that's why they're cash poor. That's why First Nations are broke. It's not because we're bad at managing resources. It's not because we're lazy or we don't pay taxes or any of the other racist kind of things that people say about First Nations in Canada. It's because we don't have land. And I think that that's the big land back ask of the Holy See, is that they, in the spirit of reparations towards truth and reconciliation, healing and justice, that they not only provide, the land that they acquired illegally here in Canada and return that back to the First Nation, but also a very substantial cash settlement. Yes. I think that Indian residential school survivors and their children and their grandchildren should not have to ever stress financially about, paying for things like therapy.
Right.
Being able to afford to exercise, eat healthy, all of those things that come with cash.
Yeah.
I think that the Vatican is on the hook for some major, cash settlements to folks. And I'm not talking about the kind of thing that Canada did, this kind of mass trauma event of, residential school survivors having to literally hit check marks of the types of abuse they hit, literally, like you got 10,000 for getting buggered or by a priest. It's
terrible.
It was insane how detailed it got. My mother, all my aunties went through the process, and it totally screwed them over. Like they were completely, relapsed back into alcohol or whatever, right? Whatever way to deal with that re-traumatizing event that was brought by the Canadian process attached to the apology, of Stephen Harper's government, and it was very problematic. And that's where I think, hopefully those Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that were affected by the Catholic Church's role, that there is some kind of reparations paid by the institution directly to those families. And I'm not talking to some pot of money that goes to, that's managed by some board of Indian glitterati people and their allies to go into programs run by people to whatever.
More committees.
No. I mean, cash in their accounts where they can pay off their debt, buy some land if they want, send their kids to college, afford therapy, and be able to eat healthy.
Amen.
These are the kinds of things that folks that went to residential school should never have to worry about again. And the Catholic Church is in debt for that.
Yeah, and I think that I hope that there, obviously there's at least a plan in place to try and get the Pope here and do a more fulsome apology on the lands, yada yada. And let's hope that there's more forthcoming. And I think a repudiation of the doctrine of discovery and all of that stuff that needs to happen. But anyway, we can go on all day about that, but we want to talk about this fantastic book here because there's not disconnected from all that I mean, as you said, your grandmother, your mother, you have roots in the church, and it's the church that has been responsible for all of this abuse and generational trauma that's been laid on. Let's start just talking about the first section. I really love how you laid out the books in these sections, and the first section entitled "Flight" is really it's the toughest reading in the book. Because it's in that book, in that section of the book, I think that we get a real picture of what life was like for you growing up. It's heartbreak and abuse and hurt and the violence that you experienced at such a very young age, and how so many people who you should have been able to trust betrayed that trust. It's gut wrenching. And you were a young man who was angry, and you had a lot of anger. And it had taken hold of you. You describe a period of time of becoming disillusioned with school. And I want to read just a short section of the book, and then I'll pick up with a question on the other side.
Sure.
Clayton, you're right. I had become disillusioned with school and was getting into consistent arguments with teachers, especially social studies teachers, about what they were teaching about Canadian history. Why did the social studies books have only 2 pages about Indigenous peoples? Why did the Native components of the social studies book in Northern British Columbia have profiles on Plains Indians? Everybody in my age bracket learned that Indians lived on the prairies in teepees and ate pemmican, which was berries mashed with dry buffalo meat. Everybody learned that we migrated over the Bering Strait from Asia. Social studies is taught in a bizarre little tidbits, as though Canada had not been a collection of Indigenous nations before colonization, manifest destiny, and a doctrine of discovery. When I read that, I thought about my own education as a descendant of white settler colonialist, and about how little I learned, and how most of the learning I've had has been, quite frankly, in the last 10 or 20 years from people like you, Clayton. Like, I mean, I'm ashamed that my school in Newfoundland didn't teach me better. You know what I mean? Like, it's shocking. You described a period after that as a time of spiraling, and you write that you couldn't be sure if the world was a mess or if you were a mess. you weren't really sure, you said, or if it was a little bit of both, but that everything was going to shit is the way you describe it in the book. I wonder if you can share with our listeners a little bit about what that anger did to you, and what it led you to.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I'm always really grateful for is my mom, my relationship. And I think that's very obvious with the memoir. She writes the foreword.
Yeah.
And actually gives me her consent to tell my story.
Thought that was beautiful, by the way, because I was like, sometimes these memoirs are, there's a lot of honesty in here, right? So it was really nice before I delved into it to hear your mom say, I want you all to know that Clayton has my blessing,
Well, and I wish that I could have got that. I'm not, I wasn't able to get consent from everybody that I shared stories about, my memories about in the life that I've lived. Some people I don't talk to anymore. We got beef, whatever.
Yeah.
Lost over time. Yeah. But for the most part, I really did try to get consent, for most of the content that's in my memoir. And, part of the storytelling, about in that first segment of the book, and really talking about trauma, and just the subtlety of what it's like to grow up Indigenous, and facing systemic racism. And, you really feel gaslit,
Right.
And, I don't know if the listeners understand what that term means, but, you're being wronged, and things are unfair, and you're being told that it's all on you, and that, that your feelings aren't real. And that's how I felt, my entire education. I ended up dropping out in grade 8, from school, and then finished some school in juvenile detention as a teenager, and tried to go back to school when I got out of juvie here in Winnipeg in grade 10. They put me in, and ended up getting expelled from that school again because of some of the problems that I had, some of the behavioral choices, I guess, that I had made at the time. But throughout it all, one thing that I was always heightenedly aware of, like very conscious about, was fairness, equity, justice, inclusion, diversity, all of these things, are things that my mother taught me growing up, and things that I saw her call out when she witnessed, them not existing, I guess, in her space. And
Right.
I know for myself, just the feelings that I felt, in Canada's school system and the erasure of such beautiful and complex history, and the fact that our history books only start, at 18, whatever.
155 years ago or whatever.
Yeah. It's just like really, really new. And I think that's where it just kind of, I couldn't deal with it. And I wasn't successful in the school system because I just had too many questions about what they were teaching, about the kind of morality that those kinds of teachings ended up being instilled in a lot of the peers that I had. And the way that it didn't challenge, the kind of interpersonal racism and internalized racism that students, experience. The curriculum really backed that up. And then, fast forward, to my children's school experience, my kid came home the other day and was rightfully pissed off. He's like, yeah, man, my teacher gave this like messed up assignment to the class. They got to find a fictional fantasy book or movie that exemplifies the Indian residential school experience and then write a report on it.
Oh my God.
To a grade 8 class of mostly white kids. And then of course, the entire class, looks at my son, who's the one Native kid in the class. They live in an affluent, rich white community here in Winnipeg and go to a francophone school and, do everything in French, en français.
Right. Yeah.
And he came back and he was just choked. He was like, yeah, all the class was asking me questions. And I'm like, what the fuck? Why are you coming at me?
Right.
Ask the teacher. That's their job, not my job.
Right.
And so he brought the complaint forward, and the teacher actually asked him to write a paper on why the assignment was screwed up.
Jeez.
Which pissed him off even more.
I was going, really?
Really?
Let me explain to you why this is terrible shit.
And then so to counter it and to try and turn it into a positive, I told my son he's coming with me to a conference in California next month.
Yeah.
And I'm giving the keynote, and it's actually about the book, and about the Indigenous experience in Canada. And then afterwards, my mother and my 13-year-old son Jackson and myself, we're going to be doing a panel on the intergenerational impacts of residential school and what we as a family are doing to try and stop cycles of abuse and dysfunctional patterns in our family. We call it the project.
Right.
And it's all about really doing what we can to give these kids tools to be able to function in inherently racist institutions like the K-12 school system here in the country, to be able to approach it in a positive way. So when my son's going to speak actually about how he felt by this teacher giving this assignment to a bunch of kids who have not had exposure to critical race theory, have not had gone to any decolonization workshops or anything, and they're just kids, predominantly of affluent, parents, white parents, to do this really complex comparison between fictional fantasy and the real live lived experience of genocide by Canada's First Nations peoples. It's like, who thinks this shit up?
Yeah, who comes up with
that?
I mean, if you tried to write the fiction, you'd say, no, that's too crazy.
So I mean, so it's for me, I think that rage that I felt as a young person, and just hearing the going through the racism and getting into fistfights with other students when I was a kid, because racism in the 80s was wild, it was a little more hardcore.
It was intense.
Oh yeah.
And it's fighting was a normal thing. I mean, today kids don't fight as much, and the police get involved and stuff, and thankfully, thank God, not that I'm pro police, but I know I am pro my kids not getting beat up
coming home
and being safe at school to speak their mind. But so I think it's great now that my son, he comes back from this experience, he's pissed off about the racist nature of the curriculum, And then he's very proactive about it. He writes a paper about why the process was
Yeah.
flawed and why it set him up for lateral violence in his class. I was super
Right.
proud of him.
Yeah, he
Now
sounds
he's-
incredible.
Yeah, and now he's going to do this presentation with his dad and his gookum,
That's
his
cool.
grandmother
Right,
at the
yeah.
conference in California, and talk about it,
That's awesome.
as how his generation is being impacted by the discourse on residential school and
Right.
by, the settler colonial state history of Canada. And so,
Yeah.
That's great.
Wow.
You there's a section in the book where you share with your readers, and you write about becoming a warrior, and you talk about some of the powerful mentors that showed you what being a warrior could really be like. And I wanted to share with our listeners just a section of the book. You talk about your description of what a warrior really is, and you're right. I was inspired not by violence because I'd seen enough violence. It had no romantic allure for me. In my mind, violence was something I associated with weakness rather than strength. Not that I condemned it on principle. Look at history. Sometimes justice needs a helping hand. But in my life, violence had all too often targeted the wrong people, like the weak harming the weaker, or the strong lashing out in a moment of weakness. And to me, the warrior acts out of strength. The person who uses violence to achieve a political goal is a soldier, not a warrior. A soldier may be brave and may be honorable, but the fact is, in the best case scenario, the soldier never has to resort to violence. Violence is just a tool, but a warrior is defined by the struggle. Without struggle, he is something else. The struggle is in his heart. He can't put it aside on weekends or retire from it. He is engaged with it. It holds him up the way the air keeps a hawk in the sky. It is his purpose. And you talk a bit about the program at the Medicine Fire Lodge that you were a part of, and how it helped you begin the journey of living your life with dignity instead of pride. I wonder if you could maybe share a little bit more about that, and how that accentuated that idea of who a warrior is and you becoming a warrior.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of romanticization of the idea of a warrior. I think in a lot of communities, certainly in the Native community, that's one of the things that I'm constantly like seeing, is the kind of tensions between, different aspects of the community, the Native community, when we talk about what a warrior is, and like a lot of people when they hear about Oka, the Mohawk Crisis, it was the largest mobilization of Canadian military since the Korean War at that time. 50,000 plus infantry mobilized against, I think, 40 plus Mohawk warriors in an armed standoff over the expansion of a luxury golf course, that would have been built over top of ancestral burial grounds in their pine forest around the community of Kanesatake by the town of Oka, it's a pretty little town in Quebec. And, that was a really, really powerful moment. I remember being a little kid and watching the news with my mom and seeing Ellen Gabriel, who was the spokesperson there of the Longhouse, of the grandmothers of the Longhouse. And for sure, there were a lot of dudes involved and like big voices and puffy chests, and a lot of the warriors themselves that were masked up and were carrying arms, like pictures of them in the media and all that. But I was really struck personally by this powerful woman, this matriarch, that was young too. I mean, I think she was in her 20s at the time.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
And just got on the screen and was just full of fire. But like, and I remember years later having the privilege to work with Ellen on a pipeline campaign out there in Quebec that was threatening their community. We didn't win that campaign, but I remember, talking to her and her calling out, at different conferences, some of these young warriors that glamorized Oka, to promote militancy in their own struggles,
Right.
And I saw her, correct a lot of these young warriors that were prescribing to counterintelligence measures, counterintelligence strategies to the federal government, private sector corporations, and given the resourcing situation in most grassroots frontline struggles, that's a pretty uneven playing field. And I was always struck by her. She was talking to this one warrior one time at this Toronto conference at the University of Toronto, and they were really like, we got to slam the system. We got, fuck cops. We got to really fire, like amazing, young person, young leader. And it was painful to watch her. She said, you can't really say it like that. Like when we sent those warriors in to pick up arms, that was after we had exhausted every possible circumstance. And, it was very painful for us grandmothers, us clan mothers, to send our warriors into that circumstance because we knew that they might not come back.
Right.
And so their lives were in our hands, and the lives of those that they were going against, so the Sûreté des Québécois, or the OPP, or whatever, the RCMP.
Yeah.
I mean, there were multiple police forces on top of the military involved in that operation. And she said, we had to take all of these lives into consideration before we made the choice that that we have to do the actions that we did to stop these bulldozers from bulldozing over our ancestors' graveyard for some fucking golf.
Yeah, for some golf dude.
Some greasy golf player,
It's true. Yes.
But the point is that she talked about the consequences and the high price that you pay, when you make these decisions, that there's a spiritual dimension to it as well.
Yeah.
As far as accountability to our ancestors and the guidance of our ancestors in these conflicts that we face and that we have to overcome. And so, in my line of work, I my job is to speed up the transition off of fossil fuels, off the fossil fuel economy into the renewable energy economy. And, part of that work is like dealing with the complexities of just neocolonialism and like existing systemic racism and like, the bottomless pockets of extractive industries that are, basically have taken over the Canadian government. We live in a petro state now. Where the government has effectively cut off philanthropy from frontline communities, because of the legacy of Stephen Harper and the Canada Revenue Agency, and the way that he pushed for audits of charitable tax shelters in this country. Canada's made it really, really hard for communities to get funding, for nonprofit work and advocacy work. And Trudeau's government hasn't changed all of the bad things that Harper's done because it benefits them too, and so I think like the warrior today, is somebody that takes into consideration all of these things and that is accountable to the traditional governance apparatuses that continue to exist today, separate and aside from the Indian Act chief and councils that exist in First Nations, these colonial government infrastructures that were designed to fail.
Right.
And so, I think that that's a big balance. When I was in my 20s, I remember, being in the media and swearing at union leaders and swearing at religious leaders.
Fuck the man.
Swearing at the government. I think I was in the cover of the Free Press almost once a month saying F you to somebody. And but I realize now that a real warrior has to approach this work, because it's healing and justice work from a place of love, and of compassion, understanding, kindness, humility, courage, truth, respect. These are the principles that a warrior has to carry in their heart when we do this work of building the future that our kids deserve. And part of that means holding great reserve and not losing your shit, when you're in a really bad situation. And I think that a big, I think, in talking to men of faith here, on your podcast, a big part of that is the spirituality and prayer.
I agree.
And, and having those tools that come with prayer to be able to clean yourself out, because you pick up a lot of toxic things, organizing communities towards community self-determination and overcoming some of these threats, like, and especially like the existential threats like climate change.
Yes.
It's hard to really, do this work, stopping bad things from happening, dealing with existential threats like climate change, while trying to hold Canada and all those parties responsible for things like residential school, because our communities are in such a state of collective crisis and trauma, and mass trauma events continue to occur. And I think that technology exacerbates like that collective experience, because we all find out about things like almost as soon as they happen on our social media devices. And it's
good and bad, right? This democratization, we know a lot more, but we hear them through our own echo chambers, so
yeah. And just one more thing on the warrior thing, like for myself, I spent a lot of years fighting in the climate justice movement, fighting for Indigenous rights, mobilizing. And we've had a lot of victories collectively, like over mega pipeline campaigns, Keystone XL, Northern Gateway Pipeline. We won the Trans Mountain Pipeline in BC, but then of course Trudeau turned around and bought it with tax dollars. That price tag has ballooned from $4 billion to over $21 billion now at this point, which is just absolutely psychotic. When you think about all the good that can be done with $21 billion during the era of the climate crisis. And so, and so I think that for the warrior, like discourse, I know for myself, like I had a lot of good victories using the ball of rage that we talked about, that that every Native kid has, using that ball of anger and the feeling of mistrust, and just this ball of rage, this condensed ball of hatred in my tummy. I use that as fuel in the advocacy work I've done over the last few decades. And in the last decade, I come to the realization, and I think it's just through maturation and experience and, things like becoming a father, going through a divorce, major life events. I just figured out that it's not sustainable to do this work if you don't do it from a place, like I said, of love. You can't work from a place of hate and all of that, because eventually those things begin to consume you, and you eventually become what you hate, or what you're fighting against to try and undo, and it consumes you. And so, I really believe and prescribe to this idea of the sacred feminine creative principle. And I'm very humbled, because in 20 years of organizing on climate justice issues, fighting against big oil, supporting our Native communities to build economies of the future, it's Indigenous women, grandmas and aunties and moms and sisters and daughters that, and granddaughters that have been leading, and that for the most part are directly responsible for the 25% of fossil fuels that have been kept in the ground, in the last 20 years. It's Native women, Indigenous women, that have been leading that charge. I mean, Native men like myself and others are there, and they show up in that, but for the most part, it's been the leadership of Indigenous women that have created those moments like Idle No More or Standing Rock, and moments that are to come in the future. And so, I think that just seeing a lot of that, and my own experience with the matriarchs in my own family growing up, I just learned that you really have to really, really work from a place of faith, and of humility and of love, especially in doing this work, because, you're not just being a campaigner, you're also doing, peer-to-peer support counseling, you're doing crisis intervention. A lot of these community leaders I work with in the climate justice movement, they got their families are dealing with the same stuff my family's dealing with. And
there's a lot of modeling, eh? Over to Ian.
One of the fascinating parts of your book is just how much you had accomplished at such a young age, particularly given the amount of trauma that you've had in your life. I'm going to read part of your book and then have a question on the other side. You write, at 19 years old, I was working at I was working as the executive director of Aboriginal Youth with Initiative and sitting on Winnipeg's Gang Prevention Committee alongside the mayor and the chief of police at 19. Wow. Many of the skills I had acquired running the drug house for the Manitoba Warriors were completely transferable to working for the nonprofit mafia in the inner city.
I love that line, by the way.
That's a great line. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had gained the respect and recognition that I had yearned for. You go on and say, I was a high school dropout with a criminal record. Excuse me. I was a high school dropout with a criminal record and been involved with the city's gangs. I had benefited from many of the city's Indigenous programs for high-risk youth. I had won an Aboriginal Youth Achievement Award for confounding Aboriginal youth with initiative because of my ability to adapt, assimilate, and talk the talk. And you said you become an activist at a very, very young age. And as you say in the book, activism is not easy to define. And while you were on an upward trajectory, you also had to deal with the challenges navigating the years coming up. Can you share with our listeners a little bit about what it was like to be going through that incredible time of change and as well as being so young?
Yeah. Well, I guess just a bit of context for those that haven't read my memoir. My older brothers started the largest Native gang in the country, the Manitoba Warriors, and
different kind of warrior than what you were talking about earlier. Yeah.
Well, yes and no. I mean,
okay,
the Manitoba Warriors was originally, a program, a transition program for convicts,
right?
For felons.
Yes.
It was created as a job opportunity for felons integrating back into the community to get, jobs doing security at powwows or cultural events or just Indigenous conferences. And, it was a great idea. But, things kind of spiraled and economic realities, I think most notably kicked in, and, other things started to happen with the club. And I know for myself, when I was a teenager and I came here to Winnipeg for the summers, I got to hang out with my older brothers, and gosh, they were like the coolest, like most powerful, hippest natives. Like they had long hair, wore their hair in braids. Like, I mean, they spoke the language. And they were just really popular here in the city, like people respected them.
Yeah.
And, I think when I got out of juvie, I came back to Winnipeg to live with my mom, and things didn't work out, and I ended up on the streets here in the city. And, I contacted my father, and I never grew up with my dad. And at the time, I'd only spoke to him a few times, and, because I was living on the streets, I was like desperate. So I called him. I was like, yo, man, I need help. And I've never asked you for help before. So, can you help me out? And he's like, well, I'm not going to send you money, but if you want to work, I'll get you some work. And I was like, oh yeah, man, like that's awesome. Thanks, Dad. And he gave me a number to call, and that number was my Uncle John, who I had lost touch with, but had been spending some time with and completely idealized. And, within a couple of days, I had met my Uncle Brian, who was the president of the gang at the time, and they set me up in a house, which was a drug re-up house, where, street dealers could come and re-up and from me, and, that sort of thing. So, and I wasn't a gang member per se. I was just an associate, but because of my status as a younger brother of one of the founders, I was able to, be an associate without having to get jumped in. And I think later on in life, I was able to, go get an education and leave that environment with the permission, without, what most Native kids would have to go through if they tried to get out of a gang that they were working for. You get jumped out, which could mean death, certainly lifelong, like physical damage. And so for me, that time was really intense because, at the end of my time working for the Manitoba Warriors, my older brother had got wind of just some serious heat that was coming down. The federal government of Canada was passing anti-gang legislation at the time, and Here in Winnipeg, there was an epidemic of young people being recruited into gangs like Indian Posse and Deuce Knights. And, all of this, of course, being controlled by the biker, gangs, the Hells Angels,
Yeah.
And so, I was a part of that. I got to be involved in that, make some money from that. And then, my older brother, he sat me down one day and he just said flat out, he's like, yo, man, you're too smart to be doing this kind of work. You should go get an education and do something good for our people, do something for our nation, He said, I'm going to go home to Pucketawagan to our res, and I'm going to have like 5 kids, and I'm going to get married, and I'm going to hunt moose, and I'm going to fish, and I'm never coming back to the city. And he said, and I hope you do the same.
Wow.
And it was really interesting because the next day, my son's mother, Corinne, sat me down and had like this is almost like her and Johnny had been planning.
Wow.
And she sat me down too and was like, I really like you, it's awesome dating you and I want to be with you, but I didn't sign up for this gangster shit. Like,
Yeah.
She's like a little white girl from like a rich neighborhood, and Mennonite, and and so I did, I asked for permission from my Uncle Brian, and he gave me permission to go to school, and with a very ominous warning that if he ever found out I was dealing on the side while getting my education, he'd fucking kill me. So,
well, there's that.
I was like, okay, sounds good. Yeah, I'll go to school. And, but I got myself into a couple different programs over just a little over a year. One called Anishinaabe Awaji, which means Indigenous peoples leading the way. I got my GED there. Plus a bunch of other really amazing life skills. And then I got into the Medicine Fire Lodge program, which was created by local famed activist and organizer and leader, Larry Morissette. He passed away, unfortunately, a few years back. But, Larry, his program was like supposed to be this like certificate in community development, but, it was much more than that. It was like a hardcore critical race theory, like how to train a revolutionary kind of curriculum. And at the end of it, you do your own community development project, and you get like a $2,500 bursary from the federal government, which was like a shit ton of money.
Big money.
Oh yeah. I was like, oh man, I could use that. That was like buy a car money at the time. That was like, like big money at the time to me. And, so I started a youth organization. At the time I was very inspired and started chumming around with Native youth leaders that were part of the Native youth movement. And Native youth movement in the 90s was this beautiful, powerful social movement initiative that was really grounded in Indigenous culture and ceremony. And these young, sovereignty activists from Winnipeg, they started doing workshops in the inner city community centers at high schools, started doing protests like against police violence outside the courts, all kinds of different activities in the community. And, and as a young person kind of coming out of gang life and, just being disillusioned with everything, they were really inspiring to me. And at the time, though, they were too radical and didn't have any kind of formal structure to get funding, to do even more work. And so I said, well, why don't we start a youth organization? And then we can get funding. And they were like, wow, we don't want to subscribe to these colonial things. And we're not incorporating Native youth movement. And, that's the white man's way. And I said, wow, that may be the case, but, we can call it something else. And then, so we called it Aboriginal Youth with Initiative. And, and it grew very rapidly because of the vacuum that existed here in the city.
Yes.
So we had a lot of staff and 4 offices in different intercity community centers and high schools, and we're doing after school programming, and basically like the totality of our programming, during the time of AYI was really centered on decolonization and really switching the whole pipelines to prison kind of, realities of our community here in Canada, with Native people being the biggest demographic in the prison population and only being 5% of the population, our goal was to switch that to pipelines to ceremonies, getting young people out of the inner city, getting them out into the lodges that exist around Winnipeg, Sundance, sweat lodges, shake tent, introducing people to pipe ceremonies, drum making and rattle making workshops, supporting young mothers in the community, that were underage but having a kid, and so how do you raise a kid, so we had a teen adolescent pregnancy program, support program, like just a bunch of cool stuff. And then politically, we used that initiative we had this idea in a brainstorm we had one day, and we said, well, there's all this bureaucracy we've got to work through as Native youth trying to create programming here in the inner city of Winnipeg, but there's all this layers of bureaucracy, and how the hell do we get through all of this? And so we started an initiative to create youth councils at the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs here in the province, as well as the Assembly of First Nations, and internationally as well. And we literally built a wormhole, through all these levels of bureaucracy, all the way up to the United Nations, and began to create these institutions that still exist to this day.
Exist today, yeah.
And began to consult with the federal government on some pretty major multi-million dollar, like $500 million worth of funding streams. Wow. Earmarked for young people across the country, youth programming, and it was pretty hardcore. So I guess just to the times were very exciting. I think because there had been an absence of really like empowered young people, Indigenous youth, with a really comprehensive understanding of just colonialism. And I think some of the best ways to deal with helping our young people get through youth and survive to their adulthood and have opportunities, culture, language, and access to those realms where you can talk to your ancestors, ended up being the number one most powerful way to get young people onto a better path. And I know for myself, anytime my life has gotten hard, I just go back to, my sacred bundle, and, I smoke my pipe, and I talk to God, I talk to Creator, and I talk to my ancestors, and I ask them for help. And so, the whole goal of that time was, how do we get all these young people to like wash away the taboo of ceremonies, to not feel guilty because you might have taken a drink or smoked a joint or, gambled or, whatever. Whatever your trauma response was, in that you get to opening up that, your heart to this deeper conversation with the universe, and it's our ceremonies, we call it the red road, but it's the red road that, really helps people out. And I think that's what we were really effective at lifting up back in the day. I think today, that's one of the big things that I hope comes out of this Pope visit and some of the other big kind of economic transformation initiatives that are happening in Canada. One of the things that I really hope to see come to fruition is a massive program where basically, if you are Indigenous, you need healing, there is transportation that'll take you out to ceremony.
Right there.
Right there, every day, or at least 4 times a week or something like that. Or if you're a young person and you want to start singing powwow, here's the places you can go and make a drum, start learning hand drumming, or sit at a big drum and learn that. Like, I just think that there needs to be a massive investment in accessibility, to exactly that, whatever it is that helps you, open up a conversation with the Creator, open up a conversation with your ancestors, and to have that strength in deciding what you're going to do to move forward in a good way. And I think that, on top of that, the mental health side of things, having access to therapy, in unrestricted ways, because right now, like, you can go to therapy, but the Department of Northern and Indigenous Affairs will only cover certain specific, very like narrow indicators of mental health pieces. So you can't go in and talk about intergenerational residential school, for example, to get treatment for alcoholism.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, yeah.
not
Why would that be important? I wonder.
And
God bless them for not seeing that should be a priority.
It's completely insane, you know, and you know, you have to be pretty much like living on the street and about to die to get into any of these facilities that,
right,
you know, mental health facilities that exist in Canada as completely, you know, decimated mental health services that are available.
It's like someone said, right, that instead of, you know, we keep trying to yank people out of the river instead of going upstream trying to figure out why the heck all these people are in the river. Like, you know.
Oh, exactly. Yeah. You know, I know for myself, you know, writing this book and revisiting like all of the really intense things that myself and my family had to overcome here in these lands that they call Canada, you know, it really triggered me, you know, and I've battled myself, you know, with substance dependency, you know, over the decades, just coming back and forth between this. And you know, before the pandemic, I had an opportunity to go to an Indigenous healing center in Peru, but of course, the pandemic, school closures happened.
Right, of course, yeah.
I wasn't able to go.
Yeah.
I had to cancel the whole trip because I had to stay home and homeschool my sons.
Oh, true. Yeah, that too.
But just before Christmas, though, I had an opportunity to go back to this Indigenous owned and operated healing center in the middle of the Amazon in Peru. So I went down for a month, and you know, it was a very powerful experience. That just, it was like hitting a reboot, you know, and being able to go, you know, have the privilege to go to a facility that was Native owned too, and to participate in ceremonies on a daily basis that were, you know, Native operated, you know, from an, you know, well, it wasn't Cree, like who, you know, the people that I come from. There was a kinship though, and a certain feeling of safety, having access to be able to, you know, deal with intergenerational trauma, in a healthy way. And it just made me even more hungry for that kind of thing to exist here in Canada, you know, like, and I had looked into going to, you know, different centers, you know, for trauma. But most of the facilities in the country are very specific to alcohol and drug dependency. For sure, they have got sharing circles and supports aimed at, you know, talking, sharing, you know, about these things. But there's not like really comprehensive trauma intervention kind of services that you know, at the level, I think, of the crisis that we face in this country. And so, yeah, that's like one of my big dreams, you know, that comes from, you know, I think my early work in the 90s as a community organizer was to have these services available for our people, because like, yeah, the train doesn't stop, poverty doesn't stop, and like just bad shit happens, you know. Like I just had a nephew that took his own life the other day. He's 21
I'm
years old.
sorry to hear that.
Sorry, Clayton.
Yeah, you know, but I mean, that's just it. You know, suicide, missing Indigenous women and girls, you know, these tens of thousands of kids that are finally coming home from these unmarked graves. Like, there's just like never ending trauma in the Native community. And, you know, and I think that sometimes, I know for myself, going down to Peru to this healing center, it was an ayahuasca healing center. So we were taking the sacred plant medicine, you know, and I gotta say, it was the first time in my life that I got to get out of my element. You know, I've gone to ceremonies back home. You know, I've been a Sundance man for 2 decades now, you know, 27 years. And and you know, and help, you know, run Sundance back home, and especially singing. You know, I've been the lead singer at our Sundance for a couple of years, and singing for many decades. And I think though, like, because I was involved like at that level in ceremony, I was never able to really feel safe or unjudged by my like family and cousins and peers and stuff to like really go there as far as dealing with my own, you know, trauma from sexual abuse, and you know, shame about, you know, having addictions, and shame about, you know, just all the things I have regret about in life, you know, from the programming that I received growing up in the settler colonial state of Canada, you know, and I think every Native person is going through that. They're trying to undo what they've been indoctrinated to believe, and then create like a new reality where they feel stable and they can like feel safe to like make decisions, not just for themselves, but for their families and communities. And
that's awesome.
So yeah, like
I'm glad you had an opportunity to do that.
yeah, I really hope that people can have access, not to go all the way to Peru for culturally relevant,
But they
like,
experience it
support,
here.
but we should have that here.
Have it
And
here,
it should
yeah.
be so restrictive to just everything is so built around very narrow points of intervention when it comes to mental health and decolonization and healing here in this country. And I think that it's consistently underplayed, just the level of stress that Native people carry,
Yeah, definitely. Hey, we're just about out of time, Clayton. Should we get our one? That's okay. No, we just wanted to, before we let you go, we have a listener question, because we did have someone that wanted to ask something that read your book. So maybe Ian, do you want to tee that up, or Kevin?
Yeah, while we're getting ready to tee that up, I'll say this, Clayton, that we may be out of time, but I mean, we had questions, you've answered them all. Like it's like, we don't need to ask that. He's just answered that. It's fantastic. It's like you read our minds somehow, as we want to talk about the spirituality and about all this stuff, and you talked about
ceremony, and
it's great. So I'll get the technical end ready over here. Ian, you cue it up.
Listener questions. Yes, so Clayton, for your understanding, we have a thing on the Vickers Crossing called Listener Questions, where we get a listener of the Vickers Crossing to ask a question for you. And this question comes from Lydia Kesem, and she is a faithful listener from London, Ontario, and this is their question for you.
Hi, Clayton. It's Lydia. I just wanted to say I enjoyed reading your memoir, The Life in the City of Dirty Water. My question for you today is, what was the defining moment in your life that made you decide to turn your ways from troubled youth and adult to back to your Cree roots and environmentalism?
Aw, what a cute auntie.
She's a great auntie. She does a lot of care for a lot of people, I gotta tell you.
Yeah, that's great. I keep having flashbulb moments, as I go through life that entrench me deeper into, I think the responsibilities that I was born to, see through. So it's hard to name like what was the big one, but I know for myself, probably the catalyst moment was the one I just shared, like when my older brother, compelled me to get out of drug dealing and to do something with my life that wasn't just positive for me, but positive for our people, to do something positive for our people, not end up like our father. Our dad died of cirrhosis. He passed away at 58, and which is like the median age, I think, life expectancy for
crazy
men in Canada, which is absolutely insane. And so like him talking to me, and then the next day the mother of my children talking to me and asking me to do something positive with my life, that ended up being a real catalyst moment, because I got myself into some of these like inner city culturally relevant programs to try and get some life skills and some job skills, and it catapulted me into this like environment that I had seen glimpses of it through my mother. And I seen like Christian like examples of it through like my hyper Christianized members of my family that dead sober and go to church every Sunday and church programming all week or whatever, right? And and not just Catholic, but like hardcore, like out there in the back 40 in the church tent talking in tongues kind of.
It up.
But for the first time in my life, I saw people that were like living that kind of sober lifestyle, but speaking the language, talking about, life and, using metaphors that were tied to our cosmology. Right. An example would be, when the thunderstorms come, my sons, because of the way they were raised, they understand, that it's a super ionosphere charged, from the Earth's, whatever, and there's a scientific process. But they also know that there's an interdimensional spiritual being known as the Thunderbird that like flies north and south depending on the season and brings healing in the form of water to cleanse the earth and all beings that live on the earth. So when there's thunderstorms in the summer, they go run outside because they know how spiritually powerful that rain is. And they know that that loud booming sound is the voice of the thunderbird, this like loving spiritual being that our Sundance is based on. And, and I think that, for me, my first Sundance, came from that conversation with my brother and my wife, Corinne, and it led me to my first Sundance at Saguin Sundance ceremony when I was like 19 years old. And, I just remember looking around that lodge and feeling like I had made it somehow.
Yeah.
And like I was right where I needed to be. And I got my spirit name at that Sundance, Strong Thunderbird Man. I got my clan at that Sundance, Eagle Clan. I got my sacred colors at that Sundance. And, and the spirit world has been able to recognize me ever since. And they, and so, yeah, I think
that's awesome.
That was the big catalyst moment.
Yeah, definitely.
Can I just say, guys, that, I mean, look, here's the thing, because like, I think we could have like a 4-hour podcast with Clayton. I really do. But I get in trouble. Here's the thing though. Pick up this book. If there's anybody out there who hasn't bought it already, I can't believe that to be true, but there must be somebody who hasn't picked it up yet. But beyond that, I mean, some of the things that you should read it for, beyond all the wonderful things we heard here, is just the incredible work that Clayton's engaged in now with 350.org. Go look them up. Learn about the tar sands. Clayton writes about the tar sands in this book. I'm not sure many people who live in our land understand just how devastatingly destructive so much of what we're doing right now is. And you can't read this memoir and not come away with a heart changed for what it means for us to all get engaged in the work of environmentalism and trying to hand on a cleaner world for tomorrow. So pick it up and read it. You've done so much, Clayton, and we're very thankful to you.
Yeah, I really encourage the listeners to follow me on social media at Creek Clayton. Follow 350 Canada on Twitter at 350 Canada to learn more about our work on the Just Transition campaign. And if you want to hear more about life in the city of Dirty Water, there is going to be, at some point, COVID willing, a North American tour. I've got a whole stage performance attached to the book and the whole 3D transmedia storytelling universe of life in the city of Dirty Water. And that's going to be coming out here in the next year. So
let us know when you're coming to this area. We want to support that.
Yeah, folks can sign up to my mail list at lifeinthecityofdirtywater.com. And there's lots of cool media and stuff on the website that you can check out. That'll expand on your experience of reading the actual memoir. So
awesome. Well, thank you for your time, Clayton, and for your work and your truth telling us. And we need to hear this, and we really do appreciate you spending time with us today on the Vickers Crossing. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Life in the City of Dirty Water is the book, a memoir of healing, and Clayton, a wonderful guest, and we certainly want to commend that to our listeners today. So thanks to Clayton once again.
Clayton's a great storyteller.
He is excellent. Wouldn't that be great if he was? He might be doing some live stuff down the road. So maybe we can hook up with him and see something in our area. That'd be great. Want to thank our sponsors again today, guys, on the Vickers Crossing, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London, Middlesex, both family owned and operated. Thanks to Hyde Park Care Pharmacy, locally owned, locally operated, locally loved, and to our friends at Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid in London today. I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's.
Kevin George here from St. Aidan's Anglican Church.
And my name is Ian. Thank you for listening.
And Kevin, remember, my friend, to always look both ways out there
before you cross the street.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!